Hey guys, so we'll be going over every single one of the new 2022 governor polls that have been released in the last few days and how they affect our governor's map. So looking at these new numbers, we have more polls from New York. New York is becoming a very polled state as Kathy Hochul seems to be more vulnerable than Democratic governors before her. We also have new polls from Ohio, Florida, another poll from Minnesota showing Tim Walz leading by a solid margin. Numbers from Massachusetts, we now have an average from the state. We also have some very close polls from the state of Arizona between Katie Hobbs and Carrie Lake, and then new numbers from Georgia, Vermont, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and more polls from Florida, and then Illinois, Michigan, and Texas. So in this video, we'll be going over every single one of these new polls that have been released and how they affect their respective races on our 2022 governor's map. And so we're just going to get right into it, starting off with the two new polls from New York. Kathy Hochul leads by 15 and 6% over her Republican challenger, that being Lee Zeldin. Hochul became governor after the resignation of Andrew Cuomo, and so this will be her first gubernatorial election. Lee Zeldin is running a pretty strong campaign and is only behind by 13.8 points in the Empire State. This is a very small margin for a Democrat in a state like New York. I mean, just look at the 2020 presidential election. Joe Biden won the state by 23.1%. So right now, Kathy Hochul is expected to underperform Joe Biden by 10 points in one of the most Democratic states in the country. And so these new polls, along with the numbers we've been seeing overall, I'm going to move the state of New York out of the solid Democratic column and actually for the very first time place it as a likely Democratic state on our map. I think that Kathy Hochul is going to win re-election. That's almost guaranteed. Kathy Hochul is not going to lose this race, but as of this point in time, I simply cannot see her winning by a margin over 15%. The polls don't even have her there, and I do think she will actually underperform polling expectations. Next up in Ohio, Mike DeWine leads by a solid margin once again by 15 points against Nan Whaley. Nan Whaley is challenging the Republican incumbent who only won his election 4 years ago by 3.7%. So I think that this time around we're going to see a much less competitive election. If you look at the overall spread of Ohio polls, you'll see Mike DeWine doing very well in basically every single one of them. The only poll that shows DeWine in a competitive race was conducted by the Ohio Democratic Party just a month ago. And so if we look at the governor polls and compare them to the Senate polls, you will see a huge discrepancy between the numbers. On average right now, Republicans are up by very solid margins in the gubernatorial election, but if you look at the average for the Senate race, Tim Ryan actually is maintaining a lead of 1.7% and has done so since the very beginning of July. So in the governor's race, I am going to categorize it as being solid for the GOP. I think that Mike DeWine is going to help out J.D. Vance in his struggling Senate election. I do think that DeWine is going to pull off a re-election win with a margin over 15 points. And moving on to Florida, Ron DeSantis leads by 9% in a new poll against Charlie Crist. This is going to be one of the biggest races of the year simply because it is the state of Florida, now the third largest state in the union. Of course, Florida has shifted to the right significantly in the last decade. In 2020, Biden lost the state by 3.4%. Go back to 2008, Obama won the state by 2.8%. Now, the biggest surprise was that in 2016, Hillary Clinton lost the state by 1.2 points, but Trump actually expanded his margin 4 years later, even though by all accounts, Joe Biden performed wildly better than Hillary Clinton. Of course, he won the presidential election, 232 all the way up to 306 electoral votes for Democrats, but Joe Biden still could not even improve off of Clinton's margin in Florida. And so looking at the 2022 race between Ron DeSantis and Charlie Crist, Ron DeSantis currently maintains a 6-point polling lead. I mean, this really is very significant. Charlie Crist is a former governor, the former Republican governor of Florida, but he really is probably not going to win his office anytime soon, or the office that he previously held. In 2018, Ron DeSantis was behind in most of the polls, and of course, he did still end up winning. So we're going to have to see some pretty favorable numbers for Charlie Crist for me to give this state to him. I think that right now, Florida is going to be a likely Republican state. I do not see Charlie Crist winning, but I think that Ron DeSantis is definitely on the path to re-election. And the next poll we're going to look at, I think, is really interesting. This one is from Minnesota, showing Tim Walz leading over Scott Jensen by 17%. So Tim Walz is running for re-election as governor of Minnesota. He was elected by a double-digit margin in 2018, defeating Jeff Johnson by 11.4%. But in 2022, he may just win by a very similar margin. As of right now, he's up by 11 points in the polls, a significant increase from his numbers just a few months ago, as the two most recent polls have both shown Tim Walz leading by double-digit margins and margins of over 15%. Now, I don't think that Tim Walz is going to win by quite a large margin. I don't think he's going to win Minnesota by a solid margin, but I do think that he can win by over 5%. For the first time ever, I'm moving Minnesota into the likely Democratic column. I think that Tim Walz can win by 5 to 10 points. So Minnesota is going to be now a likely Democratic state on my gubernatorial maps, unless something significant causes me to change my mind. And if you look at the 538 forecast, Democrats have a 96% chance at holding on to this governorship. 538 has Minnesota as a solid Democratic state, and if you look at the odds for him over the last couple of months, there really has been a significant increase here. Scott Jensen is not going to become the next governor of Minnesota. Tim Walz right now seems to be on his way to a second term, and he's probably going to win by a pretty similar margin to the one that he had 4 years ago, but I am still doubting whether or not he can win by double digits. And so now we're going to move on to the state of Massachusetts. Here, Maura Healey is leading over Geoff Diehl by 18%. This poll was conducted by Emerson College, and now we also finally do have a polling average in the second most Democratic state in the country. So Joe Biden won Massachusetts by 33.5% in 2020. However, in 2018, we saw that Charlie Baker was reelected the Republican governor of Massachusetts with almost the same margin. Baker won 66.6% of the vote. He, of course, won his first fight in 2014, winning by just 2 points against Martha Coakley. So now in 2022, Charlie Baker will not be running for re-election, and this means that Geoff Diehl is going to be the new Republican nominee, but he is not Charlie Baker. He is going to lose this race. Maura Healey is going to become the next governor of Massachusetts. Every single poll has suggested this inevitability. Maura Healey is up by 25.2% in the polls on average. There's no doubt that she's going to win this race, and so Massachusetts is going to be a solid Democratic state. There's nothing that Charlie Baker can do for the Republican Party right now, as he is no longer on the ballot. Republicans, Democrats, Independents alike all supported Charlie Baker, but not the Republican Party as a whole in Massachusetts. The most Democratic state in the country is going to go back to being governed by a Democrat. In Arizona, we have two new polls, both suggesting a very close race between Katie Hobbs and Carrie Lake. Carrie Lake just recently won the Republican nomination against Carolyn Taylor Robson, and so Lake is going to have to win back the huge chunk of the electorate that did not vote for her, but I think that as of right now, she is in a much better position than she was before. Right now, the margin for Katie Hobbs has dropped all the way down to 0.8%, making Arizona tighter than it has ever been. Previously, Hobbs maintained a 7-point lead over the Republican nominee, and so I do think the race in Arizona is going to become a lot more interesting as both candidates vie to succeed Doug Ducey, who won by 14 points in 2018 against David Garcia. We're not going to see anything like this in 2022. Doug Ducey is no longer on the ballot, so Carrie Lake is going to see a much closer election, with Katie Hobbs being a much stronger Democratic challenger in 2022. If you look at the 2018 polls, though, they were pretty accurate, as of course Doug Ducey ended up winning by a margin between 10 and 20%, right around the middle there, and that's what most of the polls had Ducey at. Many of the final polls were essentially spot on with the margin. So in 2022 right now, with the polls being so close, we really are going to see a very competitive election, and so as of right now, I do have Arizona as a tilt Republican state. A 0.8% lead for a Democrat in a state like Arizona really is not significant at all. I think that Carrie Lake does have a good chance at winning this race, even though, of course, what's going to matter the most is what happens in the next few months. But as of right now, going into September and almost even October, I have Arizona as a tilt Republican state. Definitely Democrats can still win, but I think that Carrie Lake does maintain a very slight advantage, at least as of this point in time. Next up in Georgia, we have another very high-profile election between Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp leads by 8% in this most recent poll, and of course, Stacey Abrams is running as the Democratic nominee for a second time, so this race will be an identical rematch to the race that we had in 2018 between, of course, Brian Kemp and Stacey Abrams. Kemp came out nearly on top by 1.4% 4 years ago, and this was after 2 years of Trump winning Georgia by 5.1 percentage points in the presidential election. But in 2020, Georgia flipped blue, and Joe Biden won the state for the first time for a Democrat since 1992. So Georgia right now is more competitive than ever. However, the governor election really is not going to be that close. Brian Kemp is up by 5.5% in the polls. He is a popular incoming governor, and as of right now, he is on track to winning re-election. I mean, just compare the 2022 race to this race that we saw in 2018. In 2018, Stacey Abrams was polling significantly better. She led in many of the final polls that were conducted between her and Brian Kemp, but in 2022, we're simply not seeing the same energy from Democrats. And if you look at the Senate election, though, we are seeing a much closer race. Herschel Walker is only down by 1 point in the polls, but Raphael Warnock, the Democratic incumbent, is leading. So we may see that Georgia voters will vote for a Democratic senator, but a Republican governor. So Georgia is going to be one of those major states to watch this year, just like it was in 2020. But at least on the gubernatorial level, I do not expect the state to flip. I think Brian Kemp is going to win his re-election. As of right now, 538 gives them an 85% chance at doing so, and the odds for Brian Kemp have really always been pretty high. There's not going to be runoff. Brian Kemp is going to reach 50%, much easier than he did last time. So right now, I have Georgia as a likely Republican state. Next up in Vermont, Phil Scott is running for re-election, and he leads by 53% in the most recent poll against Brenda Siegel. This poll was conducted by the Trafalgar Group and shows Democrats at just 15%, despite Vermont being the most Democratic state in the entire country. Phil Scott right now is running for his fourth two-year term in office, and Brenda Siegel does not seem to have any chance at defeating him. In 2020, Joe Biden won Vermont by 35%, larger than his margin in any other state. Looking at Massachusetts, Biden only won by 34 points. In California, it was a margin of 29 points. In Maryland, it was just 33 points. So no state was more blue than Vermont in 2020, and of course, this is the home state of Bernie Sanders. So Vermont, even though it's the most Democratic state in the country, is very likely to re-elect a Republican governor. Right now, Phil Scott has over a 99% chance at winning this race, and this is only the second poll from the state, and it has shown Phil Scott winning by an even larger margin. Previously, Scott was up by 44 points, and Brenda Siegel has yet to poll over 20% against the Republican governor. So right now, Vermont is, of course, going to be very solid for the GOP, just like New Hampshire. So we're going to see two very solid Republican governors get reelected in New England, where basically every single surrounding state is going to be blue. We also have two new polls out of both Florida and New York, but I've already gone over these two states. I have Florida currently as likely Republican, but closer to the 5-point end. I think Ron DeSantis is not going to win by double digits, but in New York, this is another likely state. I do think that Kathy Hochul is going to win by a likely margin, but closer to a margin of 15 points. I think Kathy Hochul is going to win by a margin over 10%. And so now we can move on to Pennsylvania. Josh Shapiro leads by 6% in the most recent poll against Doug Mastriano. And of course, as I've said before, Doug Mastriano is the worst Republican nominee for any gubernatorial election across the country. I think for any major race this year, Doug Mastriano is at the very bottom of the list of good Republican candidates. And so in the polls right now, he's down by 7 points, and he totally deserves it. His campaign has not been run well at all. And if you look at the most recent numbers, Josh Shapiro has led in every single poll in Pennsylvania. Yes, these two new Emerson College and Trafalgar Group polls have both shown this race to be more competitive, but these two pollsters are known for overestimating Republicans. Well, of course, many of these polls are also going to overestimate Josh Shapiro's support, with Beacon Research having him up by 13 and 14%. These two polls are obviously going to be very wrong, but even Fox News just a month ago has Shapiro leading by a double-digit margin. I don't think he's going to win by 10%. I think the race is going to be a bit closer, but I do think that Josh Shapiro has a very good chance at becoming the new governor of Pennsylvania to succeed Tom Wolf. Tom Wolf was reelected by a solid margin in 2018, defeating Scott Wagner by 18 points. And so looking at the 530 forecast right now, Pennsylvania, there's an 85% chance that Josh Shapiro defeats Doug Mastriano, and the odds for Shapiro have only gone up in the last couple of months. So right now, I have Pennsylvania as a lean Democratic state. I do not think that Shapiro is going to win by a margin over 5%, but I am pretty confident that he is going to win this race, and that, of course, is the only thing that Democrats should be caring about. Their margins are not going to be that great, simply because it's 2022. It's still going to be a quote-unquote red wave year, and so Pennsylvania, if it stays blue, Democrats will have a very good chance at maintaining all four of the upper blue wall governors. We also have a new poll from South Carolina. This is the election between Henry McMaster and Joe Cunningham. Not a race that I've covered too much, but McMaster is in a closer race than expected. As of right now, now he's only up by single-digit margins according to the two most recent polls. Even the Trafalgar Group has him up by just 8 points. So I no longer believe that South Carolina is going to be solid for the GOP, and so the first time ever, I'm moving South Carolina down into the likely Republican column. I don't think Henry McMaster is going to win re-election by over 15 points. If you look at the 2018 race, McMaster did not win by a solid margin against James Smith, and of course in 2014, we saw the election of Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley would go on to become Trump's UN ambassador. That's why Henry McMaster became the governor of South Carolina in 2017, and then he won his race in 2018, and so now he'll be running for his first full term as governor of South Carolina. Joe Cunningham is a representative representing South Carolina's 1st congressional district. I think he's running a pretty strong campaign, but this is still South Carolina, a state that Trump won by a solid margin in 2016, or close to solid margin, 14.3%, and a state that he won by 10 points in 2020. We're not going to see South Carolina flip in 2022, but Joe Cunningham is going to make this race pretty interesting. We also saw a pretty interesting Senate election in 2020, where Jamie Harrison became the best fundraiser in Senate history, outraising Lindsey Graham almost 10-1, but Lindsey Graham still won that race by 10 points. So South Carolina can be a likely Republican state, and I do think that's what's going to happen this time around, with Henry McMaster still winning his re-election. And now we have just 3 races left, the elections in Illinois, Michigan, and Texas, 3 very big and very important states. I've already gone over Florida quite a few times in this video, so we're not going to look at the state any further, but DeSantis does lead by 4 and 3% in these 2 new polls. So in Illinois, we've seen some pretty competitive elections in the last couple of years. In 2010, Pat Quinn was elected the Democratic governor of Illinois. Then he lost re-election in 2014, despite Illinois being a pretty blue state. Bruce Rauner was elected governor of the state with a majority of the votes. However, 2014 was a very good year for Republicans. They won 31 governorships after these midterms. Democrats were only at 18. Democrats would go on to win 23 in 2018, but 2014 was a very bad year for the Democratic Party, 6 years after Barack Obama was first elected in 2008. And of course, Democrats also lost the Senate in 2014. And so in 2018, though, J.B. Pritzker won the Illinois governorship, defeating Bruce Rauner by a solid margin. This was a major flip for the Democratic Party, with Illinois going blue by 15.7 points, with a Republican incumbent losing re-election. And so in 2022, we're probably not going to see a flip for a 3rd time in a row. Darren Bailey does not really stand too much of a chance against J.B. Pritzker. Every single poll has shown Pritzker ahead, but I do not think that Pritzker is going to win by a solid margin. So just like New York, I'm going to move Illinois into the likely Democratic column. I'm still confident that Pritzker is going to win, but just not by a margin over 15 points. 538, though, currently does have Pritzker winning by a solid margin, but I think that 538 does tend to overestimate Democrats in some of the more Democratic races. But Illinois is still going to be pretty solid for Democrats nonetheless. I think the margin is going to be just under 15%. So for all practical purposes, it is going to be a solid Democratic state, but technically I do have Illinois now as only likely for the party. In Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer leads by 13 points against Tudor Dixon in the most recent poll. She is running for her 2nd term in office. She was elected in 2018 by 9 points against Bill Schuette, so a very strong win for Democrats just 4 years ago. And in 2022, Gretchen Whitmer is probably going to do something pretty similar against Tudor Dixon. Tudor Dixon is the Trump-endorsed Republican nominee, and for the first time ever, we have 2 women in a Michigan gubernatorial election. And Gretchen Whitmer right now, though, is on track to winning her re-election. If Tudor Dixon wins this race, she is going to try to overturn abortion rights for the people of Michigan, and with the support of the Republican-controlled legislature, she will be able to do so. So for many pro-choice voters, Gretchen Whitmer's win is essential to protecting their rights, and right now, Gretchen Whitmer is on track to winning her re-election. She's up by 11 points in the state, and looking at the polls that have been done over the last few months, Gretchen Whitmer has led in every single poll between her and every single potential Republican nominee. So as of right now, I think that there's no doubt that Whitmer is going to be reelected to a 2nd term. I have Michigan as a likely Democratic state. So at this point in time, Democrats are favored in all 5 of the Midwestern gubernatorial elections in which they have incumbents, and I think that Democrats are going to do pretty well. Not as well as they did in 2018, though. In 2018, Democrats really did do very well in the Rust Belt. They won Pennsylvania and Illinois by solid margins, Michigan and Minnesota by likely margins, and then they flipped Wisconsin with Tony Evers defeating Bill Walker. 538 currently has Michigan as a likely Democratic state, with Gretchen Whitmer having a 92% chance of winning. So she is going to win a second term, and Michigan is going to remain in the Democratic column, with Whitmer defeating Tudor Dixon. And finally, we're going to look at that poll from Texas. Greg Abbott is running for a third term this year and is leading by 7 points according to the most recent poll against Beto O'Rourke. So, of course, O'Rourke became famous for almost defeating Ted Cruz in the 2018 special election, so in the last midterm. He also ran for president in 2020, and so far, he has a track record of losing the 2 major races that he's been in, the Democratic nomination in 2020 and the Senate election in 2018. So in 2022, as he is now running for governor, Greg Abbott is likely to trounce the Democratic nominee, but not as badly as he did in 2018. In 2018, Greg Abbott defeated Lupe Valdez by a double-digit margin. That's not going to happen to Beto O'Rourke. He is still a better candidate, but he is still down by 8 points in the polls. 8.5% is the lead right now for Greg Abbott, and this lead has been pretty consistent over the last couple of months. We are not going to see Beto O'Rourke become the next governor of Texas. I think that in, a decade, Beto O'Rourke would have a much better chance as Texas continues to shift to the left. And of course, Texas is a state that has not voted for a Democrat in a presidential election since 1976. But Joe Biden did get relatively close in 2020, only losing the state by 5.6 points to Donald Trump. And I think that Greg Abbott is going to win by a larger margin than Trump did in 2020. I have Texas as a likely Republican state. I think that there is a chance he can win by double digits, but not by any margin over 15. And so this is our new 2022 governor's map with some adjustments made after these new polls have been released. And so right now, the governor elections really are going to be very interesting to follow. I think we're going to see some pretty interesting races in states like Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, especially Kansas, where we have a Democrat running for re-election. We also have some pretty high-profile races in Michigan, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Florida. So definitely a lot to watch in the next few months. That'll be it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure you like it down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below which party you think will win more governorships after 2022. Do you think Republicans will win in Arizona? Do you think Democrats will be able to hold on to the 5 Midwestern governorships that they currently control? Subscribe to my channel if you haven't considered purchasing a channel membership for just 99 cents per month, and I will see you guys in the next video.